So what's the best starter build in Path of Exile 317, Siege of the Atlas, and Arch Nemesis League? Well, at the end of the day, the best build is going to depend on what you like. If you can't stand minions, and I say, well, Absolution's looking like one of the best builds, that's not very helpful to you. Or similarly, maybe you hate Selfcast, and I say, hey, well, Selfcast just got buffed, so you should try Selfcast Ice Nova. Keeping that in mind, these builds aren't going to be the single best thing for every person out there. They will offer good experience, there are ways in which they will excel, and I've picked things with a few simple goals in mind. First of all, let's talk about the gear. I'm framing this around day 2 to 3 gear, or week 1 if you're leveling a little more slowly. The slower you level, the easier it's going to be to pick up some of the uniques. The faster you level, the more expensive they may be, but that's just economics, and if you're able to get to the endgame that early, you'll be able to make the money to afford them. In that sense, all of these starter POBs are kind of aimed around solo self-found. The second thing I want to talk about is DPS uptime and goals. I'm assuming your goal is you want to clear most of the Atlas, you want to progress into tier 16 maps, and you want to start fighting bosses, be it the Searing Exarch, the Eater of Worlds, or maybe even the Maven. So with that in mind, are these builds gonna insta one-phase Cirrus 8? No, they're not. That's not the point of them, and to be honest, that's not what you should be looking at for your league start. If you're sitting here comfortably saying, yeah, but I get a Headhunter by day 2, congratulations, this video really isn't for you. Keeping that in mind, I've focused on 2 things. 1, having enough damage, but dealing that damage in a relatively consistent manner. So I'm looking at things that have high DPS uptime. This includes ballistas, damage over time, and cooldown traps. All of these things persist, so even if you have to dodge a mechanic, you will get effective DPS uptime out of them. Next up, a lot of these things will scale on almost no gear. In other words, things are scaled by gem level, or things are scaled by passives on your tree. This should make them relatively easy to gear. Finally, I've prioritized defenses. You'll see Determination and Molten Shell in every single build, because it's an amazing defensive combo. It's one of the strongest that we've seen in a long time, and you should absolutely be using it. Similarly, Spell Suppression is very good against bosses, which is why I've included it, and Evasion can help with early mapping, so I've splashed a bit of that here and there in most of the builds as well. And finally remember, guides are guidelines, and these POBs are to give you a rough idea of a direction to go. Don't assume that you have to copy everything item for item or line for line. In fact, in most cases, you never should do that. This is to give you an idea of where to go and what to play, and hopefully you can build on that and improve your character from there. I know this has been a bit of a long caveat, but in a lot of past League Starter videos, I've had complaints that felt like they came from a misalignment of expectations. So for this one, I've tried to make expectations as clear as possible. Starting with the first build that I'm suggesting, Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder. This was a very powerful build last League. Poisonous Concoction scales itself off of your life flask, so you don't really need very much when it comes to gear. And it's not getting any significant changes going into 317. The reason I picked Pathfinder instead of Occultist is Pathfinder gives you a lot more flask scaling, which makes it a lot easier to sustain flasks early, in combination with the fact that it's very fast. You have Poison Prolif. You can use Plaguebearer for even better clear, but if you don't always remember to toggle your Plaguebearer, that won't be a big deal, and you're not as reliant on curses for your pops. The big strength of Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder, aside of a damage scaling, is of course its speed. It's a very fast build, and it will be an excellent mapper. If you're looking to rush to tier 16s and farm maps as quickly as possible, this is going to be a very good choice. The bossing will probably feel a little bit more awkward. That's because you're going to have to wither stuff, and that's just an unavoidable thing when you're playing poison or chaos damage over time. If the bosses have new phases like Cirrus does, where all wither effects and poison effects are cleared, that'll mean you'll ramp up and ramp down during the fight. Poisonous Concoction doesn't really show its damage very well, so I'm not quite sure how to calculate how much you do. But time and time again, I've seen this build in action, and my understanding is that you get enough overlaps that you should always be overlapping all of your projectiles, and so inflicting 9 poisons on a single hit should make that a lot easier. Remember how I mentioned earlier that well-rounded defenses are something that you want to strive for? Well, in this case, the defenses we're using are Ghost Dance, something that was previously Trickster only, and is incredibly effective. It's now moved to a tree, so every build is using it, at least if they're in the area. This will turn your energy shield into kind of a buffer for your life. As long as you're not taking super frequent hits, it'll always block at least some of the damage. Next up, we've got Evasion. The evade chance you have isn't necessarily going to mean you can just stand at everything, but as long as you're only taking incidental hits, it should help for that one fast enemy that gets to you. And then armor. Armor not only provides a hefty amount of physical damage reduction, but it gives you access to Molten Shell, which is incredibly good at scaling your effective HP on a very low budget. Then finally, because this is a bossing league, and because there are tanky rares, we've got spell suppression. A lot of our abilities will be spells, and this just cuts the damage in half. Poisonous Concoction Pathfinder is for people who want to go fast, people who like mapping, or anyone who just wants to play a ranger. This is going to be one of the best ways to start a ranger, and if you're looking to play something like Poison Scourge Arrow in the endgame, or even a hit-based bow build, this could be one of your better leveling experiences. The reason I went for Pathfinder specifically is it has a ton of quality of life. In terms of where to go from here, I'd try to fit an additional aura in. This can be done by getting more mana reservation efficiency, or even using a helmet like Alpha's Howl. I'd also try to bring up the life total, as while the build has really well-rounded defenses, the life total is a little on the low end, so you'll have to be careful of damage over time. If you get recoup on your rings, for example, you could use a different helmet, and that might help you bring your life total up. For endgame, I envision a build that's much the same as this, but possibly with block scaling from something like Tempest Shield. You'll probably want to keep both the evasion and armor scaling without going too all in on one or the other, and you'll continue to add stats like poison duration, damage over time multiplier, and maybe even focusing on gain a flask charge when you're hit by an enemy, so that you have infinite flasks and you can continue to scale your damage. Gem levels will also scale Poisonous Concoction, but I left them out for this because they didn't really feel necessary, at least in the early game. Don't be turned off by the fact that the build's DPS in PoB looks incredibly low. It's very hard to calculate, and I could probably do an hour-long video just explaining how to calculate poison damage in PoB. Just know that this should be plenty, assuming you get to this point in your gearing. Next up, we have a build that I think I'm most likely going to be starting. Now, I'm considering all three things on this list, but it's going to depend on what I play in the late game, as I don't think I'll be sticking to and min-maxing any of these. That's more of a personal choice than something you have to do. All of these can be taken to the endgame and min-maxed from there. And that is Explosive Arrow Ballista Slayer. The reason I'm considering Slayer, as opposed to something like Hierophant, is my plan is to transition into Elemental Hit, and it's just a lot easier to level as Explosive Arrow than Elemental Hit. Slayer is by far the best choice for Elemental Hit currently, especially when you consider things like Secrets of Suffering or Leadership's Price. The goal here is a build that can transition into something else later, so the gear's going to look dirt cheap. Elemental Hit can be a pain at low levels, you need Threshold Jewels, Zoths, all sorts of other stuff, or you deal with rotating damage and go Trinity, and ultimately face the limitations of that. I'm getting around some of the awkwardness around barrage support by barraging my ballistas and keeping my own self-attack. If you want to see more information on the exact mechanics of Explosive Arrow, be sure to check my mechanics guide, which will be down in the description below. I've focused on a very high quality of life, scaling enough damage that I should have 1 to 2 mil DPS, adding in things like capped spell suppression and additional defensive layers so that I'll be able to survive quite easily. My ultimate endgame would be switching to something like Masterful Form, so stacking Frenzy and Endurance charges. The reason I didn't do this early on is it felt a little bit awkward with the Quill Rain. I felt like I was going in too many directions trying to scale crit and also frenzy charges, and also the damage through gem levels. But once you switch to a rare, that should be no problem. Due to the playstyle of Explosive Arrow, I don't recommend going into this blind. Try it out in Standard or try it out with some League Start practice, see how EA feels for you. If you've played Toxic Rain Ballista before, then maybe you can just jump into it because it will feel similar, but if you haven't played something like that, test it out to see if you hate it. There's a lot of little things to note about this build, but I'll go over a couple. First, you want no flat added fire to attacks. This is because that will break elemental equilibrium. Second of all, you don't want any pierce. This will break Explosive Arrow, stopping it from sticking fuses into enemies. And finally, projectiles are a massive damage multiplier, but they'll lower your attack speed. You could optionally switch to Barrage if you're going on single target, but I find it too awkward, so I'm just going to stick to GMP. I'll use the self-attack while mapping, and I'll rely on my Mirage Archer to carry me when it comes to single target, along with the Ballistas. Alternatively, you could go all in on the Ballistas and not really do any damage yourself using something like the Skirmish. If you do that, your tree will look a little different, and your damage might even be more consistent, but you lose access to things like Leech. At the end of the day, it's probably personal preference, or maybe based on the gear that you get access to. Finally, Fire Trap and Lightning Trap are both getting very significant buffs in 3.17. Before now, the de facto trap was Seismic Trap. You used Exsanguinate to clear, but let's be honest, the build was Seismic Trap. Some people are saying Seismic Trap will be fine. However, I'm very hesitant here. The change to overlaps in AoE could mean that we see a 15 to 20% DPS reduction on Seismic, which would make it fine. On the other hand, it could be a 66 to 83% less multiplier, which would completely cripple the skill. We're not going to know until we test it day one, so I've been advising that you stay away, at least for the time being. In terms of a POB here, I am going to warn you it's a little bit more complicated than the others. I'm not suggesting that you run Fire Trap, Flamethrower Trap, Lightning Trap, and Lightning Spire in a build. Pick two, Fire and Flamethrower, or Lightning and Lightning Spire. I guess, in theory, if your setup's generic enough, you could also pick Fire and Lightning Spire, but that's overcomplicated, so I suggest avoiding it. You'll want to pick up an appropriate curse, or maybe self-cast something like Assassin's Mark, but I left it out of a POB because there's a little too much pick this or that already. This build is based off of Octavian's cooldown trapper from Hardcore Scourge League. Many of these mechanics are well tested, and out of everything here, this is going to be by far the best bosser. I've put a damage adjustment of 36% more, to account for the changes coming to both Fire and Lightning Trap. I know the damage doesn't look too impressive on a lot of these things, but remember, the cooldown traps are always very deceptive. Even Seismic Trap will only look like it's doing a couple mil DPS if you examine the average hit, when it's doing tens to hundreds of millions. The nice thing about this is you get access to these gems at a very low level, so you can basically play them from the start all the way through to the endgame. Out of all the builds on this list, I think this is the best one if you want something to just sit there and min-max. You have a lot of different options focusing on trap throwing and cast speed, and using something like Slave Driver's Hands, or you could even go low life. Trap mechanics lead to easy damage scaling. Just remember, if you're going for Lightning Trap, be sure to add some pierces, and if you're going for Fire Trap, scale added damage, because it's very effective with that skill. I also feel this will probably be the most beginner-friendly out of all the builds. You need a little bit of adjustment to understand how Poisonous Concoction plays, how the projectile flies through the air, and that can take some time to get used to. Similarly, EA is delayed damage, so it won't be everyone's cup of tea. So if you're a semi-beginner, you have a decent grasp of the game, enough that you could probably grab a POB and adapt it comfortably, then this is probably the build for you. It's also the one I'd recommend for bossing, and if I decide that my early league focus is going to be on bossing, this is what I'm going to play. Personally, I'll probably be doing Fire Flamethrower Trap, just because I tend to like how those play a little better than Lightning Trap, but it's still up in the air and I could change my mind at any time. If you're looking for the path of building for either this or any of the other builds, they'll be down in the description below. And if this has helped you pick your league starter, then be sure to leave a like on the video and recommend it to a friend. If you want to see more Path of Exile content, such as how I take one of these builds and scale it into the endgame and beyond, be sure to sub to the channel and ring the bell to be notified whenever I upload. But now, before I end the video, I want to talk a little bit about some league start stuff in general. No matter what build you're playing, you should always try to consider what damage you're taking and what content you're encountering. So for something like Siege of the Atlas or Arch Nemesis, if you're encountering a lot of bossing stuff, your goal is to kill the new bosses, then you want something that has reliable single target, good spell defense, and has high damage consistency. Something like cold damage over time, another strong example that I'll be talking about later, or minions are also perfect for this. It doesn't really matter if you can do 10 million DPS while you're standing still after channeling for 4 seconds, if you never get to stand still and channel for 4 seconds. I also find that people often get too caught up in damage numbers in POB, assuming that a build has to have 5 or even 10 mil DPS to be a viable league starter. It honestly doesn't. Very often, what's going to matter far more is your defenses, and that's why I'm using Determination with Molten Shell, along with Spell Suppression on all of my recommendations. These are powerful defensive mechanics that will help you survive your mistakes, learn new fights, and scale into the endgame. Also remember, evasion is quite effective for covering for your mistakes, but it's not very good at telling you that you made them. Your health won't drop, your health simply won't move, because you evaded all the attacks. So if you feel like, I went into that pack and I was fine, but then I went into the next one and I died, it could be your evasion rating betraying you. Finally, I see a lot of people struggle to get from the basic gear in a POB to the endgame character that's fully functional. And I think one of the biggest reasons for that is people don't see POBs as guidelines. They see them as rule of law. Who just grab the POB from this video. They don't watch or hear a single word I've said. And they're going to complain down in the comments, oh, but you didn't cover blank. How do I do it? I know this isn't comprehensive, and I know I'm not covering everything, but there's a good chance that someone else will. Use other resources, do some research, and cross-check. Look on PoE Ninja, or maybe look up another guide here on YouTube or the forums. I'm going to be making a second part to this soon, where I point to several guides made by other content creators who I trust and who I think will give you more league start options. So if that's of any interest, be sure to keep an eye out for it in the near future. But for now, good luck with your league start, and let me know down in the comments below which of these builds most appeals to you. Thank you for watching, And again, a special thanks to my patrons and YouTube channel members. If you want to support me, you can do so by clicking the links down in the description below or on screen right now. You can also support by making purchases through my Nexus page. Or if you just want to chill and hang out, be sure to join the Discord. Again, links for everything are down in the description below. Thank you, and have a great day.